Brent crude just jumped nearly 5% in a single day, closing above $88 a barrel, and the reason has nothing to do with supply chains or seasonal demand or any of the usual reasons oil prices move. It's because Iran allegedly hit a power and water desalination plant inside Kuwait, in the middle of a sixth consecutive night of American strikes against Iranian territory. And one senior energy analyst is now warning that if this keeps up for just a few more weeks, we could be looking at triple-digit oil again, possibly worse. Stick with me for the next 30 minutes, because I'm going to walk you through exactly how we got to this latest price surge, the entire wild ride oil markets have been on throughout this war, why this specific waterway keeps having this much power over what you pay at the pump, and why the experts tracking this crisis are warning things could still get considerably worse before they get better. Let's start with exactly what triggered this most recent jump, because the specific details here matter. According to CNBC, oil prices rose this past Friday after Kuwait reported that Iran had attacked a power and water desalination plant, right as fighting continued escalating across the Persian Gulf. Brent crude futures, the international benchmark used by traders around the world, advanced about 4.6% that day, closing at $88.10 per barrel. On top of that specific attack, a separate tanker was also hit by a projectile off the coast of Oman, causing what was described as minor damage, according to an incident report from the United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operations Center. And this wasn't an isolated night of violence either. According to that same CNBC reporting, U.S. Central Command confirmed it had completed its sixth consecutive night of strikes against Iran that same week, hitting dozens of military targets, including logistics infrastructure and maritime capabilities. Let's think about what it actually means for a power and water desalination plant specifically to become a target in this conflict, because that detail carries real weight beyond just the immediate market reaction. A desalination plant isn't a military base or a missile launcher. It's critical civilian infrastructure, the kind of facility that provides drinking water to ordinary people living in Kuwait, a country that isn't even a direct combatant in the underlying war between the United States and Iran. When infrastructure like that becomes a target, even if it wasn't necessarily the primary intended objective of a broader strike, it signals a level of escalation and a level of risk to civilian life and civilian services that goes well beyond purely military exchanges between opposing armed forces. Now, let's back up and walk through the entire arc of this oil crisis, because understanding the full journey helps explain why markets are reacting this dramatically to what might otherwise seem like just one more incident in an already long conflict. This entire crisis traces back to February 28th, when the United States and Israel launched their joint military campaign against Iran. Iran's response, as we've covered extensively on this channel, centered heavily around threatening and eventually effectively closing the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway that normally handles around 20% of the entire world's oil traffic on any given day. According to reporting from March, Brent crude surged past $99 a barrel, its highest level since July of 2022, as fresh disruptions in the strait overshadowed whatever diplomatic gestures were being attempted at the time. That same reporting described Iran's Revolutionary Guard turning away Chinese ships and noted a Thai-flagged cargo ship running aground, contributing to genuine chaos and confusion throughout the waterway, and prices kept climbing from there. By mid-March, according to Al Jazeera's reporting, Brent crude actually broke through the $100 per barrel mark entirely, surging more than 9% in a single day as traders weighed the prospect of weeks or even months of continued turmoil in energy markets. This surge came specifically after Iran's supreme leader, at that point, Mojtaba Khamenei, having taken over the role after his father was killed in the war's opening strikes, pledged directly to maintain what was described as the effective closure of the strait. In a statement read out on his behalf on Iranian state television, he described Tehran's threats against shipping in the waterway using a specific, telling phrase, calling it a lever that must continue to be used. Think about that language for a moment. Iran's own leadership was explicitly describing its ability to disrupt this critical waterway as a strategic tool, a lever to be pulled deliberately, rather than simply an unfortunate side effect of broader military operations. President Trump, for his part, struck an equally defiant tone around that same time, posting publicly that stopping Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons was of, in his words, far greater interest and importance than rising oil prices. That's a genuinely significant statement for a sitting American president to make. It's an explicit acknowledgement that the administration was prepared to accept serious economic pain, reflected directly in the price of a commodity that touches literally every corner of the global economy, in pursuit of what it considered a more important strategic objective. According to that same reporting, traffic through the strait had effectively ground to a halt because of Iranian threats, with only a handful of vessels passing through each day, many of them specifically claiming links to China, described as Iran's key economic partner throughout this crisis. Let's fast forward through the middle portion of this crisis, because prices didn't just climb steadily in one direction. They swung dramatically based on the shifting diplomatic and military situation. Eventually, as we've covered previously, the United States and Iran reached a ceasefire and later a formal memorandum of understanding, signed in mid-June, aimed at bringing this nearly 4-month war to an end. And for a while, that agreement actually brought real relief to energy markets. According to Al Jazeera's reporting from early July, oil prices had actually returned to pre-war levels at one point, reflecting genuine market confidence that this crisis might actually be winding down for good. But that relief didn't last. According to that same Al Jazeera reporting, Brent crude surged more than 3% in a single day in early July, reversing that earlier slide back toward pre-war prices, specifically because renewed hostilities between the United States and Iran threatened to derail the fragile ceasefire that had brought the temporary relief in the first place. Brent futures climbed back above $76 a barrel at that point, the highest level in 2 weeks. Just days after that, prices jumped again, this time following Iran's attack on a Qatari liquefied natural gas tanker called the Al Raqayyat, while it was transiting near the Strait, according to Qatar's own Ministry of Foreign Affairs. A separate tanker transiting Hormuz around the same time was apparently hit by an unidentified projectile and was believed to have suffered structural damage, according to the United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operations Center. Brent crude settled 3% higher that day, at $74.16 a barrel, and prices extended their gains even further after hours once the United States revoked Iran's license to sell its own oil, with an American official telling CNBC directly that the memorandum of understanding in effect with Iran was, in their words, entirely performance-based, meaning continued compliance with its terms was required to keep any of its benefits in place. Let's talk about the specific episode involving Trump's proposed 20% toll on shipping through the strait, because it fits directly into the same broader price story, and it's a piece we've actually covered in detail on this channel before. According to CNBC's reporting from mid-July, oil prices rose again as the U.S. launched new airstrikes against Iran, reimposing its naval blockade, right around the same time Trump abandoned his demand that ships pay that 20% protection fee to transit the strait under American military protection. According to that reporting, Trump relented specifically after the shipping industry largely opposed the fee, and the International Maritime Organization, a United Nations agency, stated clearly that mandatory tolls in an international strait are illegal under international law. Genuinely worth noting here, Iran itself had also been separately seeking to collect its own tolls for safe passage through Hormuz, an ambition the United States had adamantly opposed. As part of the interim deal signed back on June 17th, Tehran had actually agreed it would not impose any toll for 60 days. So you had, at various points throughout this crisis, both the United States and Iran separately floating the idea of charging fees for passage through this same international waterway, each one eventually abandoning or restraining that specific ambition under pressure from the shipping industry, international law, or the terms of their own negotiated agreements. During that same specific stretch, U.S. crude oil, meaning West Texas Intermediate, had actually traded above $80 a barrel earlier in that trading session, as Washington and Tehran continued battling for effective control over the strait. The U.S. had bombed targets along Iran's coast that Monday, marking the third consecutive night of strikes at that specific point, aimed at degrading Tehran's ability to attack commercial shipping. And in a detail that captures just how dangerous this waterway had become for ordinary commercial vessels, Iran's Revolutionary Guard said its forces had attacked 2 supertankers transiting Hormuz specifically because those tankers had their transponders turned off, essentially trying to move through the strait without being tracked. Separately, the United Arab Emirates' own state oil company, AD Enak, reported that 2 of its own tankers had been hit by projectiles while transiting the strait, killing 1 crew member in the process. Let's bring this all the way forward to the most recent price action, the one that actually opened this entire video, because it's worth appreciating just how this specific week fits into that broader, months-long pattern. According to CNBC's reporting from just one day before the Kuwait desalination plant attack, oil prices were relatively unchanged, even as U.S. forces struck Iranian targets again, and Washington reinstated its naval blockade of Iranian ports near the strait. U.S. crude for August delivery closed at $79.60 a barrel, with Brent settling at $84.95. Central Command had confirmed carrying out yet another wave of strikes against Iran that same period, targeting dozens of military assets. And this is where we get one of the more important quotes in this entire story from Saul Kavanik, a senior energy analyst at MST Marquee, who told CNBC directly that the latest escalation showed how expectations of a rapid reopening of the strait had been premature. His exact words were that the hostilities and reimposed blockade had set the conflict back onto what he called an escalatory trajectory. And then came the warning that should genuinely grab your attention. Kavanik said that oil could retest $100 a barrel if the current intensity of hostilities persisted for a few more weeks, or head even higher still, if regional oil infrastructure itself became a direct target? Sit with that warning for a moment, because it's coming from a professional energy market analyst, not a political commentator or an alarmist headline writer. $100 a barrel, the threshold this exact crisis already crossed once back in March, is being described as a realistic possibility if the current pace of strikes and retaliation simply continues for a few more weeks, with the potential for prices to climb even higher than that specific threshold if the fighting expands to directly target actual oil infrastructure itself, rather than just military bases, tankers, and now, apparently, civilian utility infrastructure in countries like Kuwait. Let's talk about why the Strait of Hormuz specifically has this much power over global oil prices, because it's worth reminding ourselves of the underlying mechanics driving every single one of these price swings we've just walked through. At its narrowest point, the strait is only about 21 miles wide, with the actual navigable shipping channels used by oil tankers considerably narrower than even that. And yet, under normal conditions, before any of this crisis ever began, somewhere around a fifth of the entire world's oil supply passed through that exact stretch of water every single day. There simply isn't a comparable alternative route capable of handling that same volume. Saudi Arabia does have its own pipeline running from its eastern oil fields to its western Red Sea coast, specifically bypassing the strait entirely. And we've discussed previously how that pipeline has helped insulate the kingdom somewhat from the worst of this crisis. But that single pipeline's capacity falls dramatically short of replacing the sheer volume that normally flows through Hormuz for the region as a whole. That's exactly why we keep seeing the same basic pattern repeat itself over and over throughout this entire crisis. Any specific incident, a tanker hit by a projectile, a desalination plant struck in Kuwait, a fresh round of American strikes, an Iranian threat to maintain the closure of the strait, sends prices swinging dramatically because traders around the world understand just how little slack exists in the global oil supply chain if this one specific, narrow waterway becomes unreliable or genuinely closed for any extended period of time. Let's think about what this actually means for ordinary people, well beyond the traders and analysts watching these specific price movements in real time. Every time Brent crude climbs several dollars in a single day, that increase eventually works its way through the entire global economy, showing up in the price you pay to fill up your car, in the cost of shipping goods internationally, in airline ticket prices, in the cost of manufacturing anything that relies on petroleum-based materials or energy-intensive processes. A jump from around $80 to potentially $100 a barrel, the kind of move Kavanik specifically warned could happen within just a few weeks if current hostilities persist, isn't an abstract number on a financial news chart. It's the kind of shift that genuinely affects household budgets for millions of families around the world who have absolutely nothing to do with the underlying conflict between the United States and Iran. Let's also think about the specific psychological and strategic dimension of oil prices in this particular conflict, because both sides appear to understand, and to some extent to actively leverage, exactly how much power this specific lever holds. Iran's own leadership, as we discussed with that direct quote from Mojtaba Khamenei back in March, has explicitly described its ability to disrupt the strait as a lever that must continue to be used. Language that frames global oil market disruption not as an unfortunate side effect of Iran's broader conflict with the United States, but as a deliberate, calculated strategic tool aimed specifically at inflicting economic pain on the wider world, pain that might in turn generate international pressure on the United States to ease its own military campaign. At the same time, Trump's own public statement that stopping Iran's nuclear ambitions mattered more to him than rising oil prices suggests the American administration has been willing to accept exactly this kind of economic pressure as the cost of pursuing its own broader strategic objectives, rather than treating oil price stability as a red line that would force it to back down from military action. That's a genuinely difficult dynamic for the rest of the world to be caught inside of. Two major powers, each explicitly willing to accept, or even actively leverage, massive global oil price volatility as a tool in pursuit of their own respective strategic goals, while ordinary consumers and businesses across the entire planet absorb the actual economic consequences of that volatility in real time. Let's also revisit that specific warning from Kavanik about regional oil infrastructure itself becoming a target, because that represents a genuinely important, still unrealized escalation point worth understanding clearly. Everything we've discussed so far, tankers being struck, a Kuwaiti desalination plant being hit, military bases absorbing strikes, represents serious, genuinely consequential escalation. But none of it yet represents a direct, sustained assault on the actual oil production and export infrastructure of major Gulf producers themselves, the actual wells, refineries, and export terminals that generate the oil supplies this entire global market depends on in the first place. If this conflict were to expand to directly and repeatedly target that kind of core oil infrastructure, Rather than the shipping lanes and military assets it's currently focused on, Kavonic's warning suggests prices could climb considerably higher than even the $100 threshold this crisis has already touched once before. So let's step back and put this entire sprawling story together into one coherent picture. Oil prices have been on an extraordinarily volatile, multi-month roller coaster ride throughout this entire Iran war, breaking $100 a barrel back in March amid the initial strait closure, gradually easing back toward pre-war levels as a ceasefire and formal memorandum of understanding took hold in June, and then surging repeatedly throughout July as that fragile agreement collapsed, replaced by renewed strikes, renewed tanker attacks, a reimposed naval blockade, and now this most recent jump specifically tied to an attack on civilian infrastructure inside Kuwait. Throughout all of this, both the United States and Iran have demonstrated a clear willingness to accept, or in Iran's case, arguably actively leverage, the resulting economic pain and volatility in pursuit of their own broader strategic objectives. And professional energy analysts are now warning that if the current pace of hostilities simply continues for a few more weeks, we could realistically be looking at another return to triple-digit oil, with a potential for even higher prices if this conflict ever expands to directly target the region's core oil production infrastructure itself. This is exactly the kind of story that deserves sustained, careful attention rather than being treated as a single day's market headline. Because, unlike a purely financial story driven by interest rates or corporate earnings, this specific oil price crisis is directly, intimately tied to an active, ongoing military conflict, one that can escalate or de-escalate literally overnight based on a single strike, a single retaliatory attack, or a single diplomatic breakthrough or breakdown. Every family filling up their car, every business managing shipping and logistics costs, and every country trying to plan its own economic policy around energy prices is currently at the mercy of exactly how this specific, narrow waterway crisis continues to unfold in the days and weeks ahead. I want to know what you think happens to oil prices from here. Do you believe Saul Kavonic's warning about a potential return to $100 oil actually plays out if this current pace of hostilities continues? Or do you think diplomatic pressure eventually forces some kind of de-escalation before prices climb that high again? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because I read every single one of them, and this is exactly the kind of conversation I want happening on this channel. And if this video helped you understand exactly why oil prices keep swinging so dramatically throughout this entire crisis, share it with someone who's been watching gas prices rise and fall but hasn't understood the full story behind it. Hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and I will see you in the next video as we keep tracking exactly how this story continues to unfold.